in my very first sermon, which I preached on a youth Sunday on January 25th, 1981, I shared a story that tied in perfectly with my message that morning. 38 years later, that same story came to mind as I was studying the text from Hebrews 11. And so I decided that I would share it again with you. It is the story of two young boys, twins, but boys who had very different personalities. The one was deeply pessimistic, while the other was an incurable optimist. Worried about their two sons, the parents took them to see a psychologist. The psychologist decided to try an experiment with each of the children. First, hoping to brighten the spirits of the pessimistic child, he took him into a large room filled with toys. However, upon entering into this room, this young boy burst into tears. Surprised by the reaction, the psychologist asked him, "What's the matter? Don't you want to play with these toys?" The young boy responded, "Yes, but if I do, I just know that I will break them." Next, the psychologist turned his attention to the other boy. This time, he took him into a different room, a room that was filled with manure. Upon entering the room, unlike the first boy, this young boy let out a shout of excitement. Again, surprised by the reaction, the psychologist said, "How can you be so happy? Don't you see what this room is filled with?" This time, the boy said, "Sure I do. But with all of this manure, there's bound to be a pony under here somewhere." Now, in an attempt at full disclosure, when I first shared this story in 1981, and as I share it with you today, I find myself relating much more to the first boy in the story. I wish it weren't the case, but I have always tended to have pessimistic qualities. I see the glass as half empty, not half full. I see the cloud, never the silver lining. I have always blamed this outlook on the fact that I am a lifelong Philadelphia sports fan, where my teams have had the uncanny knack over the years of taking certain victory and turning it into bitter defeat. Consequently, I have always admired optimists, those who can see the potential good in any situation, those who see the glimmer of light at the end of the dark tunnel, those who can envision that their team will come back and win in the final inning. As I consider the difference between optimists and pessimists, I think it boils down to a sense of vision. Their circumstances may be exactly the same, but the way they view those things varies significantly. The pessimist sees only the negative, while the optimist focuses on the positive. And while I definitely would not consider myself an optimist, I do consider myself a hope-filled person. On the surface, that may sound strange, perhaps even contradictory. contradictory. But as I was preparing for my message this morning, I came upon a distinction that someone made between the two, one that made good sense to me. According to Pastor Mike Foss, optimism is born of the human spirit. Its strength is the strength of one person's spirit. In other words, optimism is grounded in ourselves, how we look at things, how we view the reality that is before us. But according to Foss, hope is somewhat different. He states it this way: hope is grounded in God. In other words, it is how God looks at things. It is how God views the reality that is before us. And because God is faithful, when God makes a promise, we can be hope-filled. Because unlike us, God is able to see clearly into the future. As the author of Hebrews reminds us, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Rather than trying to explain this, let me offer you two real-life examples of those who came to understand this truth in their own lives. The first person is someone very likely familiar to most of you. He was the subject of our first lesson. He was mentioned again in our second lesson, and he was even highlighted in our opening hymn this morning. Of course, I'm referring to Abraham. As you may recall, the Lord came to Abraham. He told him to leave his homeland, to go to a foreign land, and promised that he would make of him a great nation. And as I mentioned to the children, despite the fact that Abraham had no heir at that time, we know that Abraham did as the Lord commanded. And as we turn to our first lesson for today, from the 15th chapter of Genesis, 10 years have passed since God made his initial promise. But Abraham's situation has not changed at all. He still has no son. His wife is still not pregnant. Thus, as Abraham views this situation for himself, he is becoming a bit pessimistic. He starts to think that one of his servants will ultimately become his heir. But in the midst of this dialogue that happens between God and Abraham, the Lord invites Abraham to see things through fresh eyes, through God's eyes. God brought Abraham outside and said, "Look toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them." Then he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." Despite the absurdity of the promise, one that even the greatest optimists could not have envisioned for themselves, we discover that Abraham believed what the Lord told him. He trusted that God could see what he couldn't see. He trusted that the God who made the promise was able to fulfill it. And in God's time, that is precisely what happened. The second person is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a 20th century Russian novelist, an outspoken critic of the Soviet Union and communism, most known for his book, The Gulag Archipelago, which chronicles life in the Soviet labor camps, in which he himself spent 8 years. It was during his time as a political prisoner, forced to work 12-hour days, receiving barely enough food and water to survive, that Solzhenitsyn became seriously ill. One day, while he was shoveling sand in a blazing hot sun, Solzhenitsyn simply could not keep going. He stopped working, even though he knew the guards would beat him severely for this seemingly defiant act. Just then, he noticed one of the other prisoners, a fellow Christian. This man moved cautiously toward him, and then he drew a cross in the sand before immediately erasing it, knowing that this too could be seen as an act of defiance that would lead to a severe beating. However, Solzhenitsyn describes how in that moment, in that seemingly simple act, hope of the gospel came flooding into his soul. The cross, the symbol of Jesus suffering for the sake of others. The cross, the symbol of Christ claiming victory over sin and death, had renewed the hope of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And even though his circumstances had not changed, he was now able to see things through fresh eyes, through God's eyes. And that gave him the courage to continue. When God seems slow in fulfilling his promises, just like for Abraham, or when God seems absent in the midst of our times of suffering, like for Alexander Solzhenitsyn, may we remember that we need not be pessimists, and that we can be much more than optimists. For ultimately, we can be hope-filled Christians, having a hope that is grounded in our God, the God who remains firmly in control of both our present and our future. Amen.